In August 2022, the Asian American community in California was shocked when Dr. Yue Yu, a renowned dermatologist at Providence Mission Hospital, was arrested for allegedly poisoning her husband with a dangerous chemical. A glass of water, a red drain cleaner bottle, and a hidden camera. These are not props from a detective movie, but three key pieces that started a tragic case behind the doors of a $1 million mansion. The accuser was none other than her husband, Dr. Jack Chen, who once built an image of a perfect family with her in the city of Irvine. They lived in a $2.7 million mansion, had 2 young children, stable careers, and embodied the ideal image of an educated Asian American doctor family. But the glamorous exterior was just a thin coat covering long-standing conflicts and untold secrets. Video evidence, testimonies, and a gripping investigation began to unfold. But the question remained, was it a wife's sophisticated murder plot, or a high-stakes legal drama by the husband to gain custody of the children and assets? The story you are about to follow will reveal every shocking detail behind the $1 million family facade. If you are ready to embark on a journey to uncover the dark truth, like, share, and subscribe to not miss any details. Our main character, Yue Yu, 45 years old, of Chinese descent, graduated from the prestigious University of Washington School of Medicine in 2006. She then interned at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and quickly became a resident at Boston Medical Center before the age of 30, an achievement not easily attained. In 2010, she moved to California and began working at Providence Mission Hospital. There, she was one of 2 dermatology experts who received a microsurgical certification in 2021. Her husband, Dr. Jack Chen, 53 years old, was a resident in the diagnostic imaging department at a hospital in a neighboring city. Both were respected names in the Asian American community. Wealthy and educated, they had 2 children, born in 2013 and 2014. From the outside, this seemed like a model family. But when the clinic lights went off, the cracks were growing every day. In April 2022, Dr. Jack Chen began experiencing a series of unusual symptoms: intermittent stomach pains, prolonged diarrhea, weakness, and persistent insomnia. What was strange was that he noticed a chemical odor in his daily tea, but initially thought it was due to his sensitivity or food allergies. As a medical professional, he self-prescribed treatment for the initial symptoms, but the condition worsened, prompting him to go to his own hospital for further tests. The endoscopy results revealed stomach ulcers, esophageal damage, and signs of intestinal inflammation, unusual injuries that were hard to explain. Despite following the treatment protocol, his health continued to rapidly deteriorate. Faced with the abnormal progression of his illness, Jack Chen began suspecting external factors were at play, especially when his marriage to Yue Yu was becoming strained. He began to suspect that someone was deliberately tampering with his food and drinks. To clarify his suspicions, Jack Chen decided to install a hidden camera in the kitchen, where his wife often prepared food and drinks. This device opened up a chain of unbelievable truths, completely shattering his illusion of a stable marriage. In the days following the installation of the hidden camera, Jack Chen checked the footage every night. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But one day in mid-May, he saw a scene that left him stunned. In the video recorded on May 11, 2022, his wife bent down under the sink, took out a red plastic bottle, and calmly poured an unclear liquid into the familiar glass he used every morning. On May 18th, the same action was repeated. In another footage on May 25th, the camera clearly recorded Jack Chen sitting at the dining table, finishing the glass of water his wife had prepared. There was no doubt that was the same glass that had been poured from the red plastic bottle. Watching it over and over, he couldn't believe his eyes. But every detail matched, from the bottle's position to how the cupboard was opened and the indifferent look after the action. Then, what chilled him to the bone? That red bottle was the same drain cleaner bottle they had used to clean the kitchen pipes months ago. The label still clearly stated the dangerous chemical ingredients. After cross-referencing the camera footage with the plastic bottle found under the sink, Jack Chen confirmed it was a drain cleaner containing sodium hypochlorite, a powerful bleach commonly used to clear clogged pipes. The label warned, "may cause skin burns, dangerous if swallowed. On the morning of June 4th, he went to the police to report the entire incident. The complaint included a video clip directly extracted from the hidden camera, clearly showing the repeated pouring of the strange liquid into his glass of water. The police filed an initial report with charges of intentional poisoning and sent the case to the local prosecutor's office. The public began murmuring about a famous doctor poisoning her husband with cleaning chemicals. Just one day later, as a victim of domestic violence, Jack Chen filed for an emergency protective order, requesting the court to remove his wife from the home immediately. At the same time, he filed for divorce and sought full custody of their 2 children. But the next shock came from the court. Yue Yu was allowed bail after posting a $30,000 bond. A controversial figure, as it was much lower than typical bail amounts for attempted murder charges, usually $1 million or more. Why? Despite the video recording of the pouring action, the police could not directly prove the connection between Jack Chen's symptoms and the consumption of the drain cleaner, missing test samples and definitive medical evidence. Even the defense lawyer argued, if Yue Yu truly intended to kill with her dermatology expertise, she could have used more sophisticated poisoning methods. Using such an obvious chemical was too blatant. Even in the forensic and criminal law community, poisoning with drain cleaner is controversial. While this substance can cause burns and severe injury if ingested, it is not classified as a deadly poison by criminal forensic standards. Moreover, manufacturers often mix the liquid with a very strong chemical odor, making accidental ingestion almost impossible unless intentional. Just a sniff would make you nauseous, let alone drinking an entire glass. Therefore, the question arises, would a highly skilled doctor like Yue Yu choose such an easily detectable method of poisoning? If the intent was to kill, why not use a quieter, harder-to-detect poison? The hypothesis that Yue Yu wanted to cause her husband's pain seems even less plausible, as divorce was still a legal, safer, and much more civilized option. The media began to exploit the story from both sides. The case hit the headlines and became a hot topic on Asian American forums. One side believed it was a cold-blooded murder plot. The other side thought someone was fabricating the entire story to get a divorce and gain custody of the children. Both Yue Yu and Jack Chen did not remain silent. At the first hearing related to the family dispute, they continuously made accusations and counterclaims, turning the civil trial into a brutal media battlefield. Jack Chen testified in court that he and his 2 children had endured emotional abuse from his wife for years. He described the marriage as living in an invisible cage with tightly controlled rules. Once, when he was ill, Yue Yu still demanded he massage her as a spousal duty. When he refused, she became furious, shouting for hours until he reluctantly complied. Furthermore, he often faced belittling, demeaning remarks from his wife, even in front of the children. When he no longer wanted to argue, Yue Yu switched to a Cold War tactic. She would not communicate directly, but would order him to do housework through the children, turning him into an invisible servant in his own home. More seriously, he said his wife forbade the children from showing affection to their father. Whenever the children were seen close to him, hugging or whispering, Yue Yu would pull them into a room and scold them until they promised not to repeat their behavior. Fearing their mother's anger, the children wouldn't even dare to say goodnight or speak privately with their father. The father-child bond became increasingly distant, and Jack Chen found himself isolated. Not only emotionally, but Yue Yu also began to conceal all the family's financial information, from bank account balances, investment decisions, to real estate transactions. He no longer had any access to their shared assets. Another factor that worsened the family conflict was Yue Yu's mother, who often lived with them, and was believed to always side with her daughter in every situation, sometimes even provoking confrontations between the couple. For years, Jack Chen endured in silence, but the more he endured, the greater the distance became, and the more suspicion grew, leading to the hidden camera in the kitchen. Another detail that caught public attention was the issue of Yue Yu's parenting methods. In 2021, a teacher at their son's first school expressed concerns that the boy might have ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. However, instead of cooperating for a professional evaluation, Yue Yu and her mother reacted harshly, claiming the school had insulted them, and quickly transferred their son to another school. The issue was pushed aside. At the new school, just a few months later, the boy caused trouble, attacking a classmate in class. The school reprimanded him, but his grandmother defended him. He has too much energy. Yet, when they returned home, she scolded the boy severely, telling him to come up with a smarter excuse to cover up his actions. Yue Yu was also accused of frequently yelling and losing control with the children, especially when they misbehaved. Once, when their daughter objected to her use of inappropriate language, her grandmother immediately defended Yue Yu. There are things adults can say, but children cannot. In response to a series of accusations from her husband, Yue Yu simply replied, "Completely fabricated." She didn't provide detailed explanations, emphasizing that it was a systematic smear campaign. Yue Yu's lawyer argued that Jack Chen intentionally set a trap, deliberately installing the camera to record his wife, not for self-protection, but to gather evidence during the divorce preparation process. Furthermore, the defense also claimed that the videos submitted to the police were edited, fragmented, lacking context, and could have been placed in a misleading context to mislead the investigation. The real goal, according to the defense lawyer, was to gain an advantage in the asset and custody dispute, rather than to protect health or prevent risk. In other words, it was a premeditated plot. Yue Yu's lawyer continued to emphasize the nature of the suspected substance. The drain cleaner had an extremely strong smell and a powerful corrosive ability, making it very difficult to mistake or fail to recognize, especially for a doctor with Jack Chen's experience. Is it believable that a resident doctor, someone who has read hundreds of medical chemistry documents, could drink a glass of water with drain cleaner without realizing it? This is very illogical. Meanwhile, Jack Chen responded by presenting income evidence, showing that Yue Yu was the primary breadwinner in the family, with a salary far surpassing his own. Therefore, his claim of fabricating a story to divorce and seize assets was completely unreasonable and lacked financial motive. But despite the heated arguments, the video showing Yue Yu pouring the liquid from the red bottle into her husband's glass was the death blow, sending chills to anyone who watched it. Yue Yu's lawyers tried to downplay the severity of the video. It was just an action of convenience. She only used the cup to pour the liquid into the drain pipe, not with the intention to poison. Yue Yu is a renowned dermatologist, respected by the hospital and the medical community. Being accused of poisoning her husband is a scheme to tarnish her reputation, destroy her career, and ruin her personal image. Jack Chen's lawyer quickly refuted the casual pour into the drain argument. They pointed out that the design of the drain cleaner bottle's mouth was small, optimized to control the flow, prevent spillage, and reduce the risk of direct contact with the corrosive substance. On the contrary, using a wide-mouthed cup to pour the liquid and then dumping it into the sink was an unnecessary, dangerous, and illogical action, especially for a doctor like Yue Yu, who knew the corrosive nature of chemicals. While the legal battle was intense, the public was still bewildered by a surprising reality. Despite more than 6 weeks since Yue Yu's arrest, the police had not yet officially filed criminal charges. The hearings were still held at the family court, not the criminal court. A spokesperson from the Orange County District Attorney's Office confirmed that the test results of the samples submitted by Jack Chen showed traces of the chemical substance from the drain cleaner. An important detail, but still not enough to constitute a charge. However, the authorities had not yet released the results of Jack Chen's blood and organ tests, which were considered the most important direct evidence to confirm whether poisoning had occurred. The ambiguity of the case pushed public opinion into two opposing extremes. One side believed it was a murder plot carried out by the wife, while the other side thought it was all a perfectly staged drama to seize assets and custody of the children. After months of investigation, the case was officially brought to trial at the Orange County Court in California on October 18, 2023. Yue Yu's name once again appeared prominently in the media. She was charged with 3 serious counts of intentional poisoning and 1 count of domestic violence, all of which could lead to many years in prison if convicted. In court, Yue Yu denied all charges, asserting her innocence and claiming that this was a sophisticated scheme to destroy her reputation, career, and maternal rights. While the prosecutor presented physical evidence like video footage, the drain cleaner bottle, and test results, the defense strongly countered, arguing that everything lacked clear legal binding and could easily be misinterpreted. A controversial detail was revealed during the trial. Despite having her medical license suspended by the California Medical Board, Yue Yu's license was temporarily reinstated, awaiting a final court decision. This shocked the public. A person accused of poisoning a relative was still allowed to interact with patients within the healthcare system, albeit with restrictions. According to the medical board's explanation, the license reinstatement was purely procedural, as there had been no official criminal conviction from the judicial system. However, they affirmed that if convicted, Yue Yu would be permanently removed from the list of licensed practitioners in California. During the trial, Yue Yu's defense lawyer unexpectedly changed tactics. To the astonishment of the courtroom, he presented an explanation never mentioned before. According to the lawyer, Yue Yu pouring the drain cleaner into the cup was at Jack Chen's request. Specifically, at the time of the incident, the family's kitchen was severely infested with ants. The lawyer argued that Jack Chen had asked his wife to use the drain cleaner to attract and kill the ants. Therefore, Yue Yu had mixed the liquid with sugar in the cup to make an ant trap. However, Jack Chen immediately denied the entire explanation, asserting that he never suggested his wife do such a thing and considered it a desperate attempt to gain legal points. The prosecutor pointed out the contradiction. Earlier, the defense had claimed that the cup of water containing the liquid was used to pour into the drain, but now it was turned into an ant trap. The continuous changes in testimony, lack of consistency, and lack of persuasion severely weakened Yue Yu's image in the eyes of the jury and the public. Yue Yu's subsequent actions not only failed to improve her situation, but made her legal standing even more dangerous than ever. Although allowed to meet her children weekly under supervision, Yue Yu used the opportunity to send text messages instructing her daughter to lie in court. Specifically, she instructed her daughter to testify that the drain cleaner in the house was used to kill ants because her father refused to buy traps. This action became the final straw in the eyes of the law. The incident was discovered after the daughter shared the text messages with a school psychologist, who immediately reported it to the judge in charge of the case. In a swift hearing, the court decided to strip Yue Yu of all custodial rights over her 2 children. She was only allowed to communicate through phone calls and no longer had direct visitation rights. This meant that until her children turned 18, she would have almost no opportunity to meet or intervene in their lives. All connections between mother and children were severed. The daughter, when speaking to the counselor, cried uncontrollably, saying that she was forced to comply because she feared her mother's anger and was concerned for her own safety. She also mentioned that her mother and grandmother often yelled and hit her, justifying it by saying it was for their own good. Besides losing her maternal rights, Yue Yu faced a maximum prison sentence of up to 8 years if convicted. The information revealed during the trial completely matched Jack Chen's initial testimony, from the act of encouraging his daughter to the timing of the text messages and the absurd ant-killing claim. However, Yue Yu continued to deny everything. In addition to the charges of poisoning her husband and losing custody of her children, Yue Yu was also involved in a civil lawsuit from a patient. Another wave of trouble hit her while she was still trapped in the family legal whirlpool. Although Yue Yu had previously received positive reviews on medical forums for being a dedicated, skilled, and compassionate doctor, by June 2022, one patient had left negative feedback. The doctor was rude, cold, and disrespectful. A month later, another patient formally sued Yue Yu for medical malpractice, accusing her of not properly consulting about post-operative care and neglecting her responsibilities. Notably, these negative reviews occurred at the same time Jack Chen accused her of poisoning him. This coincidence raised a series of questions. Did marital pressure affect her professional skills, or did work-related stress cause her to lose control in her family? These questions were not just the legal foundation, but also the key to understanding the deep-rooted causes of the family tragedy, from a devoted wife and excellent doctor to a suspect before the court. Currently, Yue Yu faces an uncertain future. Her family is broken, her name has been removed from the hospital's doctor list, her professional status and social image are all on the brink of collapse. The decision on her medical license has not been concluded, but she is definitely not allowed to meet her 2 children until they turn 18. She may never know where they live, what they study, or what they think of their mother. The judgment was announced. A decision not only determining the fate of one person, but also ending a family tragedy once considered a model. Because if the home, which should have been the safest and warmest place, becomes the one harboring danger, perhaps the true meaning of the word family is no longer intact. The case of Yue Yu and Jack Chen is not just a legal confrontation, but a mirror reflecting the invisible cracks in modern marital life. Questions of trust, control, harm, and limits, still unanswered. And what about you? What do you think about this case? Leave a comment below to discuss. This video ends here. If you find this story intriguing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so we can bring more strange and emotional stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Rising from the bottom of society, Evelyn was fortunate to find a life of wealth and luxury next to her talented husband, Stephen Davis. However, driven by infidelity and greed for his enormous wealth, she ruthlessly hired a hitman to kill her own husband. The case had many hidden details, from the crime scene to the people who fired the shots that night, but the police deliberately ignored them and concluded it was a botched robbery. They didn't even investigate who these robbers were when they had taken a life. Stephen Davis's mother, Margaret, refused to accept her son's unjust death. Margaret began a journey to uncover the dark plot behind Stephen's death, and she was about to discover a truth more horrifying than any nightmare. The story she would tell would shock us all. Like and subscribe to follow the courageous journey of this mother right now. The victim in today's story is Stephen Davis, a name respected by many in the tech industry. He had it all: wealth, fame, a life that many desired. But he never expected that very success would lead him into the hands of a murderer. Born on March 27, 1970, Stephen grew up in Nottingham, England, in a relatively affluent family. At 14, his father died in a car accident, making Stephen the pillar of the family, taking on all responsibilities to protect his mother and 2 younger sisters. He had to work harder than others, and that perseverance made him a genius. By 21, Stephen became an excellent programmer, invited to work for a major company in Hong Kong with a salary 3 times his current one. He seized the opportunity immediately. In the following years, Stephen became a successful entrepreneur in the Philippines, running a tech company and earning millions of pesos every year. During this time, he met Evelyn, a beautiful, sweet girl who worked at a famous bar in downtown Angeles. Evelyn Davis. Hailing from a poor island in the Philippines, she had left home at 13 to seek a chance to change her life. Without any degrees or skills, the only thing she had was her beauty. And in her world, beauty was the only ticket out of poverty. As for Stephen, it was love at first sight, and he spent £500 to free Evelyn. From then on, their relationship grew closer. After a few months of dating, they decided to get married. Stephen Davis told his mother about his future spouse. But from his perspective, Evelyn Davis was just a regular worker, born into a farming family in the Philippines. When Margaret heard that her son wanted to marry, she felt a little worried, but didn't oppose it. A girl from a poor background wasn't a problem as long as she loved and cherished her son. In 1997, Margaret and her husband flew to Hong Kong to meet their future daughter-in-law. From the first glance, she had an ominous feeling. Evelyn seemed obedient and polite, but it was just a perfect mask. During their stay, Margaret observed. The more they interacted, the more she realized that Stephen and Evelyn had nothing in common. A knowledgeable man, passionate about technology, always exploring and creating. A girl who was illiterate, knew nothing about the world outside, only nodding, smiling, and enjoying life. But she had no evidence to stop it. Her son had fallen in love and made his decision. She didn't want to interfere too much in his choice. In the end, she accepted the marriage, though she was full of doubts. In March 1997, Stephen and Evelyn officially married in Hong Kong. But what Stephen didn't know was that Evelyn was only 17 years old. She had borrowed her sister's ID, falsified her age to 21, in order to meet the requirements for marriage registration. From that moment on, their marriage was a lie. Not long after, Evelyn became pregnant. Their first daughter, Jessica, was born, followed by their son, Joshua, 2 years later. After having their son, Stephen wanted to leave Hong Kong and move to the Philippines. His parent company opened a branch in Makati, and he was appointed as the branch director with a salary of £5,000 a month, a dream figure in the Philippines. But it wasn't just a career decision. It was also because of love. Stephen wanted to live where he had met Evelyn, a place he believed she would be happier. There, he rented a luxurious villa in an exclusive area for the elite in Angeles, 3 hours' drive from the company. Every month, he gave Evelyn £1,000 for pocket money, equivalent to a year's salary of a local resident. Evelyn's life changed dramatically the day she became Stephen's wife. From a poor dancer, she rose to become the beloved wife of a wealthy family. But money was never enough for Evelyn. She grew accustomed to luxury, to expensive dresses, and lavish parties. And when greed exceeded its limits, she began to seek more. A life without Stephen. It started with unusual expenses. The £1,000 monthly allowance was no longer enough. Stephen noticed, but he turned a blind eye because he believed his wife deserved the best. But when Stephen began to control the finances, Evelyn became furious. She didn't want to be restricted, didn't want to be controlled, and most importantly, she had another man. Arnold, Evelyn's secret lover. A man who had worked as a security guard, not wealthy, but who knew the dark corners of society and how to make someone disappear without a trace. Evelyn whispered into Arnold's ear a perfect plan. If Stephen dies, I will inherit all of his wealth, the house, the savings, and the life insurance in England. The plan was set. 3 men, Arnold, Alexander, his friend, and a third unknown person, took on the mission. They watched Stephen for weeks, learning his schedule, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. On the night of July 17, 2002, Stephen and his colleague Michael worked late, leaving the company to head to the apartment the company rented at 10:45 p.m. At 1 a.m., Michael returned after picking up his girlfriend from the airport. As they were about to sleep, Michael's girlfriend felt something was off. She heard footsteps outside the door, and a flashlight flickered under the door. The door was kicked open. 3 men burst in, one pointing a gun at Michael's head. He said to the man beside him, "Is that him? Is that him?" Michael panicked, shaking his head. They looked at each other, hesitated for a second, then quickly withdrew. But they didn't leave. They headed towards Stephen's room. The door to Stephen's room burst open. Then 4 loud gunshots rang out in the night. There were no screams, no struggle. Everything happened too fast. When everything was quiet again, Michael dared to run to Stephen's room. He was horrified to find Stephen lying motionless, blood pooling around him. The ambulance arrived, but it was too late. Stephen Davis was confirmed dead at the scene. Michael called Evelyn, but it took over 4 hours to reach her. He thought Evelyn would immediately inform Stephen's parents, but she did not. With no other option, Michael personally called England to break the news to Mrs. Margaret Davis. When she heard the news, Mrs. Margaret was stunned, collapsing into a chair. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. 2 days later, Mrs. Margaret and her husband flew to the Philippines to collect their son's body and clarify the cause of his death. But just 1 day after the murder, the Philippine police concluded that Stephen Davis was killed due to a business conflict. They claimed the murderer could have been a competitor or a business partner with conflicting interests. Michael, the witness to the event, immediately realized the absurdity. If this was truly a murder due to business conflict, then why did the killers ask, "Is that him?" This meant they were targeting a specific person, not a random murder. When Mrs. Margaret demanded further investigation, the police suddenly changed their statement. They said this might just be a case of mistaken robbery, that the criminals hadn't meant to kill Stephen. But Mrs. Margaret didn't believe them. She knew there was a hand behind this, someone who had exploited the police's sluggishness to cover up their crime. And she had a name in mind: Evelyn. Everything wasn't random. After receiving her son's body a few days later, with the sharp mind of a longtime businesswoman, Mrs. Margaret began to piece everything together. Unsolvable questions began to surface in her mind. First, when Stephen was killed, Evelyn didn't even call the family. It was Michael who made the call to England. Second, when Mrs. Margaret and her husband arrived in the Philippines, Evelyn didn't come to greet them. She didn't cry, didn't show any grief. In fact, the first thing she said wasn't a condolence, but, "Did you meet Michael? Did he say anything?" This statement haunted Mrs. Margaret's mind. Why was Evelyn more concerned with Michael's statement than the sorrow of her husband's family? Third, at Stephen's funeral, while everyone was mourning, Evelyn bluntly asked about money. She asked about the bank accounts and life insurance, as if her husband's death was just a small obstacle in her pursuit of a luxurious life. 2 weeks before the murder, Stephen called his mother, his voice heavy. He said his marriage was on the brink of collapse. Evelyn only demanded money, even stealing from him. She showed no concern for the children or the family. Stephen had begun to suspect his wife, but he didn't have time to do anything. When Mrs. Margaret was sorting through her son's belongings, she found a pawn ticket. The item that had been pawned was Stephen's wedding ring, and the pawner was none other than Evelyn. The deeper Mrs. Margaret dug, the less she could believe her eyes. When she tried to pay Evelyn's rent, the landlord revealed a horrifying truth. Evelyn frequently brought friends to the house for partying, throwing lavish gatherings even while Stephen was at work. These weren't ordinary friends, but strange men. The landlord even considered evicting them, but Stephen was a good man who always paid on time, so they let it slide. But when they learned he was dead, they finally spoke out about Evelyn's true nature. Still, the Philippine police dismissed all of Mrs. Margaret's suspicions. They said the evidence wasn't convincing enough, and that Evelyn might just be a grieving woman trying to survive after the death of her husband. Mrs. Margaret was angry, but not surprised. In a place like the Philippines, where crime runs rampant, the police were too accustomed to murders and robberies. A foreign woman crying foul over her son's death? Nothing to be concerned about. Mrs. Margaret turned to the British Embassy in the Philippines, hoping for intervention from the British government. But all she received was indifference. They told her she should return home, that interfering in another country's legal system wasn't feasible. Desperate, Mrs. Margaret realized that no one was on her side. No police, no government. No one wanted to touch a case that could implicate hidden powers. If the whole world turned its back, she would be the one to uncover the case. From there, she decided to work on the case herself, as the police should have. But danger was always lurking. A local resident warned her that anyone who benefited from Stephen's death would see her as an obstacle. If she kept investigating, she could be the next target. But she wasn't afraid. She had lost her son and had nothing left to lose. But the investigation was not easy. Mrs. Margaret realized she needed someone who knew the area. So she paid for a private investigator in the Philippines, assigning the task of secretly monitoring Evelyn 24/7. At the same time, she used money to exchange information, contacting Evelyn's family, friends, and acquaintances. A former colleague of Stephen revealed that in the last months of his life, Stephen had suspected Evelyn. Their relationship had become tense, primarily because Evelyn had an affair. Furthermore, when Stephen took his daughter Jessica to school, he discovered that she hadn't been enrolled. The tuition fees he had given Evelyn had been spent by her. After being confronted, Stephen had a serious talk with Evelyn. He demanded she choose between the family or her affair. But Evelyn didn't want to give up her comfortable life. When Stephen decided to cut her allowance, she became resentful towards him. Stephen's colleagues warned him that Evelyn might do something reckless, but Stephen still believed she was just angry. When the private investigator followed Evelyn, an important clue emerged. She frequently met a man named Arnold, even being affectionate with him at her own house. After weeks of surveillance, the investigator discovered 2 other men who also visited Evelyn's house regularly. One of them was Alexander, Arnold's friend. Clear photographs were taken. Evelyn and Arnold hugging at a hotel, exchanging cash, and laughing together. The evidence became clearer than ever. Evelyn was not a grieving widow. She was enjoying a luxurious life with Stephen's money, even before he died. Mrs. Margaret decided to present this evidence to the police. However, due to limited funds, all travel and investigation costs were paid by her. When the Philippine police arrested Arnold and Alexander, Michael, Stephen's colleague, immediately came to identify them. He confirmed they were the ones who broke into the house the night Stephen was killed. Arnold and Alexander were interrogated. Initially, they remained silent. But when the police presented recorded conversations between them and Evelyn, the truth was exposed. On August 16, 2002, with Michael's direct testimony, Arnold and Alexander were officially charged with murder. Mrs. Margaret believed justice had finally been served, but things were not as simple as they seemed. The two killers also named another person, Robin Butata, but they didn't know where he was. At this point, a kind police officer warned Mrs. Margaret, "Do you know, when a Westerner marries a Filipino woman, he doesn't just marry her, he marries her entire family. If she turns against you, the obedient cat could turn into a vicious tiger." This was a frightening warning. At the same time, the British Embassy sent a letter asking Mrs. Margaret and her husband to leave the Philippines immediately. They had discovered something. Before being arrested, Arnold and Alexander were former police officers with close ties to the local mafia. If Mrs. Margaret stayed, she could very well be murdered. When she dies, the case will be buried forever. But Mrs. Margaret couldn't leave her grandchildren. Jessica and Joshua were still with Evelyn. If she left, Evelyn would have full control over the children. Mrs. Margaret secretly made a plan. She gave Evelyn some money, offering to send Jessica on a one-week vacation to England. For the money, Evelyn agreed immediately. In September 2002, Mrs. Margaret left the Philippines, taking Jessica with her, but she had no intention of giving up. She continued her investigation from afar. If the Philippine police wouldn't act, she would make the world pay attention to this case. She sent a series of emails to UK members of parliament, international lawyers, and human rights organizations. She wanted to put pressure on the Philippine police to continue their investigation. Evelyn was furiously angry. She filed a lawsuit against Mrs. Margaret for kidnapping. If she returned to the Philippines, Mrs. Margaret could be arrested at the airport. Mrs. Margaret didn't stop. She wanted to save Joshua, but Joshua had been taken by Evelyn to a secret location, and no one knew his whereabouts. Not only that, she received a message from an intermediary carrying a message from Evelyn. "Joshua will meet his father soon before you can find him." This was a death threat. Mrs. Margaret understood that Evelyn would never let Joshua escape her grasp easily. As news of the situation spread, Evelyn's relatives and friends began to provide secret information. Not out of kindness, but because they also hated Evelyn. Through the same intermediary, a relative of Evelyn finally revealed the truth. Joshua was on Datum Island, living with Evelyn's parents. Mrs. Margaret immediately contacted them, but she knew they wouldn't hand over her grandson just out of goodwill. She offered a sum of money in exchange for Joshua. Evelyn's parents, though heartbroken, knew they could not take proper care of Joshua. They accepted the deal. After more than a month of negotiation and completing legal procedures, Joshua was brought to England. But when he arrived, the boy was emaciated, with marks on his ankle, clear signs that he had been tied up to prevent him from escaping. Although Joshua had been rescued, the murderer had not been caught. The third killer, Robin Butata, was still at large. At this point, an unexpected detail emerged from one of Evelyn's relatives, who provided the exact identity of Robin, Gina's husband, Evelyn's sister. On June 14, 2003, 11 months after the incident, the Philippine police captured Robin. To reduce his sentence, Robin agreed to testify, and his account matched exactly with the statements from Arnold and Alexander. Evelyn was the true mastermind. She had hired Robin, Arnold, and Alexander to kill Stephen, promising each of them a large sum from his life insurance. She had given them the house keys, specifying the exact time to act. Evelyn's sole purpose, to kill her husband and inherit his wealth. On November 25, 2003, the trial of Arnold and Alexander took place. Robin's wife, Gina, also testified. She stated that Evelyn and Arnold were actually in a romantic relationship and had planned together after Stephen's death. Gina's testimony perfectly matched Robin's. The court concluded that Arnold and Alexander were guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced them to 30 years in prison without parole. Robin was granted immunity due to his cooperation with the police. But the biggest mastermind had still not been caught. Evelyn fled just before the arrest warrant was issued. The case seemed to have been forgotten. But Mrs. Margaret never forgot. On October 17, 2014, the police unexpectedly found Evelyn in a remote village in Rizal province. When arrested, Evelyn continued to claim her innocence, asserting she was not involved in the case. But no one believed her anymore. Evelyn's family and friends had turned their backs on her. Some even said that having a murderer in the family was the greatest shame. Evelyn was escorted to Manila to await trial. The entire nation of the Philippines was watching this sensational case. On November 25, 2004, the day of the final verdict, Mrs. Margaret and her husband were present in Manila, Philippines, after a long journey of thousands of miles. They had fought for more than 2 years, and today was the moment of judgment. The courtroom was packed. Journalists waited outside. The public was tense. Everyone wanted to know if the mastermind behind Stephen's death would finally pay the price. Evelyn was escorted in. She wore a white shirt, dark trousers, and sunglasses. No emotion, no signs of worry. She entered as if this was just a normal meeting. The judge read the indictment. The prosecutor announced that 14 witnesses were ready to testify. The evidence was solid, the testimonies consistent, Evelyn's crime was undeniable. But Evelyn remained stubborn. She continued to deny the charges, claiming she was innocent, that she had an alibi. But when asked to provide proof, Evelyn had nothing to show. After much debate, the court finally concluded that she was guilty of first-degree murder. The official sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Evelyn turned sharply to her lawyer, shouting, "No, it can't be. I didn't do anything." But everyone turned their backs on her. No one believed her anymore. After the trial, Mrs. Margaret's story became a phenomenon. Major newspapers reported on the relentless quest for justice by a great mother. The 14 witnesses who had helped Mrs. Margaret were threatened. Some had to move homes to avoid retaliation from dark forces. But thanks to international media attention, the case was finally judged fairly. Mrs. Margaret had sacrificed everything to bring Evelyn to justice. 2.5 years of sleepless nights, nearly exhausting all her wealth, even having to mortgage her house twice. But she never regretted it. Mrs. Margaret wrote a book titled For My Son. The book detailed her entire journey for justice. When asked why she didn't give up, Mrs. Margaret simply replied, "I just did what any mother would do in this situation." On that day, when leaving the courtroom, Mrs. Margaret felt peace for the first time. "Stephen, finally you can rest, as a mother's long journey for justice comes to an end." What do you think of this action? Please leave your comments below. The video ends here. If you found this story intriguing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so we can bring more strange and emotional stories. Thank you for following, and see you in the next video. On July 15, 2014, in Vietnam, a horrifying murder took place. The victim, Tran Van Het, a frail husband, was brutally killed by his own wife, Nguyen Thị Doan, and her young lover, Vu Si Minh. Before committing the crime, the two culprits, without hesitation, shamelessly indulged in pleasure right inside the victim's home. But immediately after, the two perpetrators quickly grabbed the mysterious weapon and attacked the victim with fatal blows. The continuous blows deformed the victim's head beyond recognition, causing severe trauma and leading to instant death. Confronted with such a gruesome crime scene, the public was left in shock. What could have driven these two people to commit such a brutal act? What was the true motive behind this horrific crime? Hit like and subscribe to our channel to uncover the full truth right now. Around 6:05 a.m. on July 15, 2005, Doan's eldest son woke up, walked into the bathroom, and discovered his father lying motionless on the floor. Shocked by the horrifying scene, he froze in place, his entire body stiff. Just seconds later, he screamed in sheer terror, his voice echoing throughout the house, waking up the entire family. Hearing her son scream, Doan rushed out, pretending to be panicked before bursting into tears. "Your father fainted. Oh my God, how did this happen?" But despite her wailing, Doan's eyes remained cold, devoid of grief. The two children started to grow suspicious. One of them stared at their father's body and asked shakily, "Why are you so calm, Mom? I see bruises on Dad's body." Doan immediately became angry, her voice sharp. "Don't talk nonsense. Your father is gone. Go inform the relatives." Doan firmly refused to let her children cry over their father's death and did not want anyone to touch the body for too long. She kept urging the relatives to hurry with the funeral, using the excuse, "The fortune teller said we must bury him early." By noon, the funeral was hastily arranged under Doan's pressure. However, when the relatives began washing Hei's body, someone noticed multiple bruises on his head and neck, clear signs of external force. "Suspicious," one of them exclaimed. "No one dies from fainting with a bruised face like this." But immediately, Doan broke into sobs, pretending to be overwhelmed with grief to divert their attention. Before they could react, Doan hastily urged them, "Hurry up. The fortune teller said we must bury him before 1 p.m., or the family will suffer bad luck." At around 1 p.m., Hei's coffin was sealed and prepared for burial. However, deep inside, his parents' suspicions about the true cause of their son's death grew stronger. By 4 p.m., after careful consideration, Hei's parents decided to report the incident to the Vusa Commune police, requesting an investigation into their son's suspicious death. Immediately, the Hunyan Provincial Police launched an investigation, ordering the suspension of the burial to exhume the body for forensic examination. When the coffin was opened, a horrifying truth was revealed. The forensic examination determined that Het did not die from an illness as initially believed, but from severe head trauma, major tracheal injuries, and massive internal bleeding. The police immediately classified this as a serious homicide case. Investigators quickly reviewed all related individuals and summoned Doan for questioning. At first, Doan pretended to be devastated, crying hysterically to mislead the investigation. However, when asked about the origin of her husband's injuries, she became flustered, lost composure, and failed to provide consistent answers. When the police asked for details of her whereabouts on the night of the incident, Doan gave vague and conflicting answers, raising further suspicions. Her statements were inconsistent. At one point, she claimed she stayed home caring for her husband, but later she said she went out to buy medicine, yet she couldn't specify the location or any witnesses. After hours of questioning, investigators noticed signs of panic in Doan as she was repeatedly confronted with contradictions in her statements. Recognizing the perfect moment to expand the investigation, authorities immediately began questioning Doan's relatives and neighbors. Several witnesses reported seeing Doan engaged in an extramarital affair with a man named Vu Si-mite. This information became a key lead in uncovering the motive behind the crime. When directly confronted about her affair with Vu Si-mite, Doan repeatedly and adamantly denied it. "I have no relationship with him. I am completely innocent." However, her denial completely contradicted the police's evidence. Intimate messages exchanged between Doan and Mun, proving that they had been romantically involved for some time. Meanwhile, authorities intensified their search for the murder weapon. During the investigation, they discovered a suspicious wooden club hidden in Doan's backyard. Traces of what appeared to be the victim's blood were still visible on it, possibly the weapon used in the murder. After forensic analysis, the wounds on the victim's body perfectly matched the wooden club found in Doan's backyard. Based on this evidence, the investigators confirmed that this was a premeditated murder. Faced with overwhelming evidence and continuous pressure from investigators, Doan began to lose her composure. Initially, she stubbornly insisted on her innocence, denying any involvement in her husband's death. However, as investigators continued their relentless questioning, Doan's demeanor drastically changed. Fear became evident on her face, and her mental state began to collapse. Finally, unable to endure the intense questioning and faced with undeniable evidence, Doan broke down in tears and confessed to the crime. She admitted that the murder had been premeditated and confirmed that her accomplice was Vu Si-mite. Immediately, the authorities issued an emergency arrest warrant for Vu Si-mite. When arrested at his home, Man initially tried to remain calm and denied all allegations. However, upon learning that Do-an had confessed everything, his face turned pale, and he lost all composure. Realizing he could not escape punishment, Man lowered his head and admitted to being an accomplice in the murder. At the police station, Do-an sat with her head down, her voice trembling as she confessed. "At first, I had no intention of killing my husband, but because I loved Ma too much, I couldn't bear to be apart from him, so I did this." Do-an then detailed the entire process of planning and executing the murder with Man. According to Do-an's confession, on the evening of July 14th, she texted her lover, Wu Si-man, informing him that she had prepared 6 packs of sleeping pills. She clearly arranged for them to execute their plan on the night of July 15. Initially, they planned to use poison, secretly mixing it into the victim's food to make it seem like he had died of natural causes. To finalize their plan and discuss the details, the lovers secretly met at Thai Market. However, during their meeting, they abandoned the poisoning idea, fearing it would be too easy to detect. Instead, they chose a more discreet method of murder. That afternoon, Man went home, took a knife, and cut a branch from a mango tree to use as a weapon. Meanwhile, Do-an hurriedly bought a duck and sent her son to buy half a liter of alcohol for Hae. That evening, Hae drank heavily during dinner. In a short time, the bottle was empty, and he became heavily intoxicated. Seeing his wife suddenly being affectionate and caring, unlike her usual self, he felt extremely happy and unsuspecting. Taking advantage of his intoxicated state, the two criminals seized the opportunity to proceed with their murder plan. After dinner, Do-an gently handed her husband 5 pills, claiming they were painkillers for his back, urging him to take them immediately. Trusting his wife, Hae swallowed all 5 pills and went to bed on the first floor, falling into a deep sleep. Meanwhile, Do-an's 2 sons, one 20 years old and the other 17, were upstairs playing video games, completely unaware of what was happening. At that moment, Do-an picked up her phone and texted her lover, informing him that Hae was asleep and the time to act had come. Around 10 p.m., Man quickly rode his bicycle to Do-an's house. He hid his bike in a banana grove behind the house, then climbed over the wall and sneaked into the backyard, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Before committing the crime, the 2 lovers sneaked into a bedroom on the 2nd floor, right next to the room where Do-an's sons were playing games, to have an intimate moment together. Afterward, Man carefully discussed with Do-an that they needed to lure Hae outside before attacking him, as killing him inside the house risked alerting the children. Immediately after, they both went downstairs to execute their plan. Man hid on the staircase, waiting, while Do-an gently entered the bedroom, pretending to wake Fake. Hae up affectionately, coaxing him to go outside to use the bathroom before coming back to bed so they could be intimate. Completely unsuspecting, Hae followed his wife's words without realizing he was walking into a death trap. As Hae stood next to the water tank relieving himself, Man suddenly struck him forcefully at the nape of his neck with the wooden club, causing him to collapse instantly. In that painful, fateful moment, the unfortunate husband weakly called out to his wife for help. Do-an. But instead of helping, Do-an coldly signaled to her lover to continue the brutal attack. Receiving the signal, Man relentlessly struck the already weakened Hae multiple times until he was completely motionless. Then, Man dragged Hae's lifeless body into the bathroom, carefully checked his breath, and coldly said to Do-an, "He's gone." Worried, Do-an asked, "Are you sure he won't come back to life?" After thoroughly checking and confirming that Hae was dead, Man climbed over the wall to escape. However, as he reached outside, he realized that his bicycle was gone. It turned out that a neighbor, seeing an unfamiliar bicycle left outside at night, mistook it for a thief's bike and took it home for safekeeping. With no other choice, Man climbed back inside, handed the murder weapon to Do-an for safekeeping, then took a face mask from her, covered his face carefully, and walked home to avoid being recognized. Upon hearing Do-an recount the entire crime, investigators were appalled by the sheer cruelty and inhumanity of the wife and her lover. One investigator looked directly at Do-an and slowly asked, "When your husband was dying, he still called your name, desperately begging for help. How did you feel at that moment?" Do-an lowered her head, clenched her hands tightly, and trembled. Suddenly, she burst into tears, tears streaming down her pale face, her breathing becoming rapid. But in the interrogation room, no one showed sympathy. Everyone knew this was not genuine remorse for the crime she committed, but pure terror upon realizing she had no escape, that a harsh sentence awaited her. Meanwhile, in another interrogation room, Mon sat leaning back in his chair, initially appearing much calmer than Do-an. He even smirked, looking straight at the investigator, and said defiantly, "I love her. I did everything for her. If I had to choose again, I still wouldn't regret it." However, when the police presented concrete evidence, especially the murder weapon, Mon began to sweat and lost his arrogance. When asked, "After killing Hit, did you feel afraid?" Mon remained silent for a moment, then slowly replied, "Yes, I never thought it would end up like this." Do-an and Mon both admitted to the murder. However, instead of taking responsibility, they immediately turned on each other, shifting blame, turning the interrogation into a bitter dispute. Do-an defended herself angrily. "I only followed Mon's orders. He told me that if we didn't kill my husband, we would never be together." Mon refused to take the blame, quickly countering, "It was Do-an who suggested this. I loved her, so I foolishly went along with it." After admitting their crimes, Do-an and Mon were officially charged with premeditated murder. Investigators quickly completed the case file for trial. Upon hearing of their mother's arrest, Do-an's two sons were completely devastated. The truth was so cruel that they couldn't believe what was happening. One of them broke down in tears, choking on his words. "We used to love our mother so much, but we can't forgive her. She destroyed our family. She murdered our father." Neighbors, along with the families of both Hye and Do-an, were in shock. No one could believe that the woman who had cared for her family for years could so cruelly murder her husband. So what drove Do-an to make such a tragic mistake, leading her down the path of this heinous crime? To find the answer, let's go back in time, to her past, where the hidden struggles and twisted thoughts gradually pushed her toward this fateful path. Winky Do-an was born in 1976 in a poor family in Lesa Village, Busa Commune, Kimdong District, Hungnyen Province. Life in the peaceful countryside was full of hardships. The villagers spent their days in rice fields and sweet potato farms, struggling to make ends meet in constant poverty and hardship. At the age of 17, following her family's arrangement, Do-an married Chun Bun-hae, a man 9 years older than her, kind and hard-working, but not financially well off. Hoping for a better future, Do-an and her husband left their hometown and moved to the south to start a new life. Thanks to their hard work and perseverance, they gradually stabilized their lives and soon welcomed two sons, born in 1994 and 1997. They thought their happiness would last forever, but an unexpected tragedy struck. In 2008, a devastating traffic accident robbed Hye of his health, turning him from the strong pillar of the family into a sick man, completely unable to work. From then on, the financial burden fell entirely on Do-an, making their family's life increasingly difficult and hopeless. Day by day, Hye silently noticed Do-an's change. Gone were the days of care and encouragement. She became more distant and cold. He just quietly observed, his eyes filled with resignation, as he understood that after losing his ability to work, he was no longer the family's backbone. And perhaps, in his wife's eyes, he had become a burden. At the end of 2008, Do-an and her husband decided to leave their jobs in the south and move back to their hometown. Upon returning, Hye's family gave them a small piece of land. Using the savings they had accumulated over the years, Do-an and her husband built a spacious 2-story house, hoping it would mark the beginning of a peaceful new life. But reality turned out differently. Their children were of school age, but their small, barren farmland only provided enough food to sustain them, leaving nothing extra for school fees or living expenses. The financial pressure kept increasing, making the atmosphere at home more tense than ever. To earn extra income, Do-an and her husband took construction labor jobs whenever possible. However, due to the lingering effects of his accident, Hye's health had severely deteriorated. He could no longer handle heavy labor, making his work unstable. Some days he could work, others he could not. Not only did his health impact his ability to work, but it also affected his marital relationship with Do-an. Meanwhile, Do-an was entering her midlife years, craving affection more than ever. Every day she interacted with young, strong men, a stark contrast to her sickly, weak husband at home. Among them, one man especially caught Do-an's attention, Wu Si-ming, born in 1982, from Hongguang Commune, Anhui District, Hengyan Province. Ming was 6 years younger than Do-an and already had a family of his own, but to Do-an, that did not matter. Over time, Do-an began to develop twisted thoughts about Ming. After only a short period of interaction, a vague yet immoral affection quickly formed between them. Ming did not hesitate to confess that every time he was away from Do-an, he missed her deeply. Moreover, he constantly showered her with compliments, praising her for being hardworking and loyal, unlike his own short-tempered and lazy wife. These sweet words gradually took hold, making Do-an increasingly obsessed, willing to throw everything away to be in Ming's arms, forgetting that she already had a husband and children. Ever since falling for Ming, Do-an no longer rushed out of the house in the mornings. She began spending extra time fixing her hair and adjusting her clothes neatly. These changes did not escape Hei's notice. He gently reminded his wife, hoping she would reconsider, but Do-an remained indifferent, completely unconcerned. To her, Hei was no longer a man worth paying attention to. One day, Hei caught his wife affectionately embracing her lover. His long-suppressed rage exploded as he clenched his teeth and warned, "If I ever see you two together again, I'll deal with you right then and there." Instead of being afraid, Do-an's husband's threats planted a more terrifying thought in her mind. If Hei disappeared, nothing would stand in the way of her and Ming. From that moment on, the idea of killing her husband began to take root in Do-an's mind, growing stronger until it became an irreversible plan of murder. However, Do-an never imagined that this fateful decision would ultimately destroy her life, turning her from a wife and mother into a murderer, forcing her to pay a heavy price before justice and her own conscience. As the trial date approached, Do-an's mental state deteriorated. Panic attacks became more frequent, and she constantly cried and begged to see her children. But after everything, her children no longer wanted to see her. To them, she was no longer their mother, but the heartless woman who murdered their father. Meanwhile, Ming also fell into deep depression in prison. He could not bear the torment of his conscience, nor could he accept the fact that Do-an had betrayed him, shifting all the blame onto him in an attempt to escape punishment. One night, Ming made his final decision. In the cold prison cell, he quietly tore a piece of fabric, fashioned it into a noose, and hanged himself. On the table, a small piece of paper was found with his final scribbled words, "I was wrong. I'm sorry." Ming's death sent further shockwaves through the public. When his family received the news from the police, they were in disbelief, but his ex-wife coldly remarked, "He got what he deserved. No one will mourn him." On July 15, 2015, at the Hengyan People's Court, the panel of judges sentenced Do-an to life imprisonment. Upon hearing the sentence, Do-an fell into despair, begging to see her children one last time, but they remained silent, refusing to look at her. Justice had been served, and the crime had finally been punished. But the most painful consequence for Do-an was not the life sentence. It was being abandoned by the very children she gave birth to. Fear crept into her heart as she realized she would have to face a lifetime of loneliness. This concludes our video. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and share to support us. Thank you, and see you in the next video.